In Europe, the 18th century was a period of intellectual, social, and political ferment. This time is often referred to as the Age of Enlightenment, for it was in the 18th century that the ideas of previous 100 years were implemented on a broad scale. In academia, the relatively new fields of calculus and mechanics began to influence thinking about the workings of the universe. Politically, the ideas of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and others would give rise to a notion of democracy that would ultimately supplant the monarchical power structure on the European continent. By the end of the century, Adam Smith's economic ideas would provide the intellectual basis for the development of modern capitalism.
Some historians prefer the notion of the long 18th century. They would like to trace the evolution of the century from 1688, when the so-called Glorious Revolution took place in England, to 1815, when the Congress of Vienna brought or marked the end of the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Other historians have preferred the short 18th century, which begins in 1713 with the Peace of Utrecht, marking the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, to 1789 when the French Revolution broke out. Whatever definition we take, however, a remarkable feature of European history in the 18th century was its expansion. One major feature of this expansion, to begin with, would be the significant demographic growth in Europe in the 18th century. There had been ups and downs over the 15th, 16th and the 17th centuries. But in the 18th century, one notices a steady development in the first half and perhaps quite a robust growth in the second. It has been estimated that population grew between 40 and 50 millions over the century. The role that demographic growth played in the future of the economy, in the future development of a country or a society, had been theoretically conceptualized by Malthus before the century had indeed come to a close.
Rising population led to the improvement in agricultural techniques, and there was great commercial expansion in Europe.
It had started earlier. Immanuel Wallerstein had talked of the emergence of a European world system of trade from the during the early modern period. It is possible to suggest that this in a way reached its term in course of the 18th century. This commercial expansion was led by the companies which had been a feature of the economic organization, particularly innovative economic organization in the 17th centuries. As a result, increasingly European economy was integrated with the economies of other countries, particularly of the New World and of Asia. And this led to a great expansion in commerce. France, England and Holland, particularly England and Holland, had taken the lead in this sphere, but other countries had not been entirely left out. What was significant was that there was not only an expansion of overseas commerce, but internal markets were organized, were integrated with greater or lesser success in different countries. The integration of the internal market had not been complete everywhere, but where it was, it led to a significant growth in internal commerce because of a growing internal demand as well. Indeed, economic historians have argued whether overseas commerce or internal commerce had a greater role to play in producing what has been described as the Industrial Revolution, as being one of the crucial factors in producing the Industrial Revolution.
There was proto-industrialization in Europe, particularly in England in the 17th century. The industries were based on agricultural and animal husbandry products.
And it reached its climactic point in England between 1780 and 1802-3, as W. Rostow has put it, when British economy took off into a sustained industrial growth. There were new machines, use of inanimate energy, new organization of production, the huge factories rather than the domestic system, the transition from the domestic to the factory system. There had been new organization and use of labor, new sources of labor. There was injection of sufficient capital, which was a necessary input for this industrialization, development in banking, improved and better communications. And all this collectively have been dubbed as the Industrial Revolution, or having produced the Industrial Revolution.
This period also witnessed a remarkable increase in literacy.
A host of new publications were coming out, fictional novels, romances, poetry, but more importantly, periodicals, pamphlets, and newspapers. They started pouring out of the presses. We know from historians' research that these books were produced, published, and they sold very well. The encyclopedias were sold in the marketplaces in many towns of France, not just in Paris. Now we have been told that the philosophers' writings had a great role to play in preparing men's mind for the French Revolution that ultimately came.
Strongly influenced by the rise of modern science and by the aftermath of the long religious conflict that followed the Reformation, the thinkers of Enlightenment were committed to secular views based on reason and human understanding only, which they hoped would provide a basis for beneficial changes affecting every area of life and thought.
Robert Darnton has drawn our attention to the role of popular literature, and he has suggested that popular literature played as significant a role as the writing of the philosophers in subverting the existing structures in the minds of men, and therefore had also been a crucial factor in preparing them for the revolution, in preparing what can be called revolutionary mentalities to an extent. There was a public sphere and there was a public opinion.
Newspapers and pamphlets shaped collective opinions of people and made them politically aware.
In Germany, the term Aufklärung, or clarification, had become a matter of public debate as early as the 1780s. And Kant once wrote that if one asked whether we live in an age of enlightenment, the answer would be no. But we do live in an age of enlightenment. Enlightenment bred individualism. The focus was on the individual rather than on the corporate structures that characterized the older societies. And this individualism bred a desire for liberty, for rights. And that's what enlightenment really produced. A major achievement of this enlightenment was that it finally ended the witch craze, which from the late 15th century had led to the killing of thousands of women, and many of them were burned to death. It is in the context of this that we now try to look at the political patterns in Europe at the, or rather right through the century. We would try to look at the evolution of the varieties of political systems that obtained in Europe at that time, and we may begin by referring to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The Peace of Westphalia brought the 30 Years' War to an end, which was notionally or apparently last of the major religious wars. The Peace of Westphalia is said to have inaugurated the modern state system in Europe. Hugo Grotius wrote after that, and Hugo Grotius had also provided the basis of an international law that should govern the relations amongst the different nations. But the system, the state system that Westphalia established was altered very frequently because war and conflict continued to be very common. It is significant to remember that European nations did not all have very clearly defined geographical idea, and certainly not many of them could pass as what we would understand as a nation in the, let's say, the late 18th or the early 19th century. There were many areas of extraterritoriality, that a state could have some territory in another country. For example, the King of England was also the Elector of Hanover within the Holy Roman Empire. Prussia had some territory in the Rhineland. Poland had what is known as the Polish corridor, a wedge between two parts of Prussia.
During this period, Europe saw the gradual erosion of local power and autonomy and the rise of national legislation and civil bureaucracies. Because of this growth in absolute and centralized power of the national government and the monarchy, this age in European history is generally called the age of absolutism.
The absolutist states which started emerging in Europe from the 16th century onwards probably reached its apogee under Louis XIV of France. The total identification of the king with the state was evinced by the saying attributed to Louis XIV, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state.
Philosophers during this era also ascribed to the notion that absolutism was good for the state and the country.
But the century that started with Louis XIV also witnessed, before it had come to a close, the beheading of a successor of Louis XIV. The divine right theory of monarchy with which we begin the century is challenged by the notion of popular sovereignty after the French Revolution starts in the last decade of the century. Rousseau had provided the basis, the theoretical basis, ideological basis for the notion of popular sovereignty. Whereas Montesquieu critiqued absolutism, and for him, the English monarchy was a civilized monarchy. So the philosophers were not against monarchy, but most of them were against absolutism. Yet, for the most part of the century, absolutism was the order of the day.
The rise of Eastern European powers like Austria and Prussia were largely a result of absolutist sentiments throughout Europe at that time.
There were, however, two countries where absolutism was really absolute and almost despotic. These were Turkey under the Ottomans and Russia, which had just at the turn of the 18th century become an important European power under Peter the Great.
These monarchies had no constitutional experience and therefore no corporate structure limiting this absolutism.
Russia had reached the Rhine by 1735, and by the end of the century, Russia was campaigning in Holland. Another significant development was the rise of Prussia. particularly under Frederick II or Frederick the Great. Prussia was launched into its great military career, and this was to end only in the 20th century, perhaps after the Second World War. Absolutism was not without its checks. There were older institutions, many of them embedded in medieval tradition or medieval origin, always tried to exert some limit on the exercise of royal absolutism. Among them we might mention church and the church organizations, noble assemblies like the Parlement in France, the representative assemblies, Parliament in England, the Estates General in France, the Cortes in Portugal and Spain, etc., and the judicial bodies, municipal councils. The nobility had always been seeking to assert or reassert its old medieval liberties and rights. And there was a constant tension between the kings seeking to maintain their absolutism by rejecting these limitations, and the nobles and others trying to establish these limitations on monarchy. The kings always try to dispense with the representative assemblies, as these are very important institutions. The Estates General in France had not been summoned since 1614.
In Spain, the king did not summon the courtiers for nearly a century.
It was only in England that the Parliament became a very essential part of the constitution, the polity. And it was achieved after a struggle for more than a century. But after 1688, the various acts ultimately produced the Parliament as a necessary and central part of the constitution, resulting virtually in the sovereignty of the king in Parliament. There were institutions in other countries. For example, Sweden. Sweden had Riksdag, which was very close to England in the sense of being true national representation. In Poland, there was the same, and in Poland there was elective monarchy, the Szlachta, or the Polish nobility, which later included the Lithuanian nobility after the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was merged with Poland in 1569. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which lasted from 1569 till 1795, when Poland was wiped off the map of Europe, had this Szlachta and the elective monarchy. The elective monarchy, however, did not provide for a very strong monarchy in Poland, and was a recipe for weakness in many ways. Now, one major problem was that in Poland, the nobles were obsessive about the fear of royal absolutism. So they introduced something, it was known as liberum veto. This meant that any one member of the chamber could overrule the king's proposal for legislation or anything. They had considerable power. The king could not declare war and peace without their approval. The king could not legislate without their approval. This was true of England, Sweden, and Poland. So the liberum veto was a recipe for anarchy, because the neighbors could induce them with bribe and other things to cast a vote against the government, against the king. There was another thing, the right to form confederation. This was a right for legitimate revolt. And unfortunately, the Confederation of Bar in 1772, which the nobles had raised to stop the reform initiative of the king Stanislas Poniatowski, provided the context for international intervention and led to the first partition of Poland in 1772 and two further partitions in 92 and 95, whereby Poland was wiped off the maps of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was the other major corporate structure in Europe. It is increasingly a legal fiction.
The Peace of Westphalia preserved the Holy Roman Empire, and at the same time it granted sovereignty to the constituent units.
The Austrian kings were usually elected the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and there were 9 electors who made this election. The Austrian kings had long given up the possibility of transforming this Holy Roman Empire into a compact state. It remained a very loose confederation, as we said earlier, virtually a legal fiction. Hungary, which was a part of the Austrian Empire and Kingdom and the Holy Roman Empire, had its own diet and administrative system, and it continued nevertheless. There was also a living republican tradition, for example. Apart from the Dutch and the Venetian Republic, there were small city republics in Genoa, Lucca, or Geneva in Switzerland. But these republics, we must remember, were hardly democratic. They were run by very closed oligarchies. The Dutch Republic had 9 provinces, and there was elective, rural nobles and the urban patricians. They constituted the oligarchy that virtually controlled the republic. The military in these provinces had been controlled by the stateholders. The King of Orange, who was the stateholder of 5 of these different provinces, and these were elective. The existence of these parliamentary institutions indicated that monarchy was a little more representative elsewhere in some of these countries. But the efficacy of these representative institutions varied. It would be probably right to say that it was only in England the parliament in the 18th century conveyed a meaning that we would understand.
The 18th century has been termed as the age of enlightenment as well as the age of absolutism. This century has had supremely powerful absolutist monarchs expanding and controlling their empires with an iron hand, and also thinkers and philosophers developing the ideology of sovereign republics. In this century, parliamentary systems functioned in several monarchies with varying degrees of success. The century that witnessed Louis XIV's rise to absolutist power also witnessed the beheading of his successor.